All right, well, let's just get started because we've got just a couple housekeeping notes. Thank you to everyone who's entered in where they're coming from. It seems like we've got quite a mix of Michiganders and Midwesterners and even some folks from farther away, which is super exciting. You can definitely feel the energy and the interest around native planting. And sorry, I'm getting distracted by raising hands. So I've got to figure out that feature yet, guys. So just be patient with me. Once Vern gets started, I'm gonna check that out. So I just want to take a couple minutes as we're getting started to introduce the Conservation District to you all. But before jumping into that, I'll just remind you that we are presenting a planning and design for native gardens featuring Vern Stevens of Designs by Nature LLC here live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and hosted by the Washtenaw County Conservation District. A couple housekeeping notes. As you might be already able to tell, you cannot speak if you are an attendee, but we do have a chat box and a Q&A box, which you can also post questions in as an attendee. You can also raise your hand, but I'll say my preference is to save the questions until the end, but if you have a relevant question as Vern is going through his presentation, type it into the question and answer box. I'll be monitoring that, and I'll try to organize questions. Oh, you can see the behind the scenes view. Well, that's fine. Let's see if I can fix that. Display setting. I don't really know how to do that. Well, I'll just keep going because this isn't very important. Thank you. So essentially, type your questions into the question and answer box. Chat, I will not monitor as closely. Swap presenter mode, somebody says. Aha! Thank you, guys. This is so great. All right. See, you can see me learning as I go here. This is, I know this is going to surprise you all. This is the second time that the Washtenaw County Conservation District has hosted a webinar. So we are absolutely green, but we're learning as we go here. So I'm going to just give you a quick overview of the Conservation District here in Washtenaw County. Oh, here we go. The Conservation District was founded in 1948. And so we have been working with residents of Washtenaw County to manage their natural resources in various ways over the years. And coming up this year, we have a few exciting programs that are relatively new. We have a school and community habitat grant, which we're launching, that provides resources and technical assistance to schools and community groups that apply for assistance. And that grant is open and available for applicants through, I believe, June 11th. And we also have a countywide resource assessment that occurs every 5 years, where we survey our residents to find out what their biggest resource concerns are. That will be happening late summer and fall. The second annual Native Plant Expo and Marketplace, which is especially relevant to this presentation today, is scheduled for June 5th. We have a plan to proceed with a typical marketplace setup with some COVID safety protocols. You can reserve a free ticket also on our website and our store, www.washtenaw.cd.org. You can also pre-order plants, mostly from Designs by Nature from Vern's farm, which he'll talk about in a moment. And then we also have a series of different webinars and conservation clips that we'll be posting via our events on Facebook and our website. And also we have a YouTube channel that we just started, and we'll be posting all of that information there. So we've got a lot of interesting things going on too on our website. So please check us out, www.washtenaw.cd.org. And with that, I am going to allow Vern to introduce himself because he has a fascinating background. And I'm going to stop sharing. And Vern, you can go ahead and share your presentation.
Hit the screen share now. So I have to try to figure out what I just did. No. So anyway, I'm Vern Stevens from Designs by Nature. And we've been in business for 25 years. And we started out in a old barn, horse barn, that we tore the sides off and turned it into a cold frame. And then we were trying to learn as much as we possibly could about native plants. My background is zoology. My other background is I was a fighter pilot for 21 years. And after I retired from the Air Force, I needed something to do. So I started working at the Michigan DNR Wildlife Division as a short-term worker. Did all kinds of wonderful jobs. But as I continued, I then learned that if I got into something that nobody else knew, I could probably move along quicker. So I did a lot of studying on prairies. I did have some work with botany in the past, but prairies were my passion. And so I would learn everything I could. We then developed a seed production program through the Wildlife Division that I was co-chair with, co-partner with. And so we were out around the state collecting Michigan genotype, little blue, big blue Indian, and switchgrass. And we actually developed production beds. We learned how to grow it out, we learned how to harvest it, and we learned how to increase the yield as we needed. And so after I retired, the business kicked in full time, and we expanded from a single cold frame to 3 greenhouses, and now we have 4 greenhouses, and we've expanded the original one to include another 400 flats that we could possibly grow. And so we were starting to concentrate just on conservation districts themselves, because my wife and I were both closely involved with the conservation district in the beginning. And then we wanted to get the word out about native plants to local conservation districts to help them out, as well as get the word out on native plants. And so in my years of the DNR, I learned a lot about the different ways that we can produce prairies, we can grow the native plants, and also control the invasives that are starting to take over. And so those were the areas of expertise that I started. After doing this for about 20 years, I could not travel around the state as much as I would have liked to, just because the demand was getting such that it was becoming very difficult. And so we opened up Designs by Nature in Grand Rapids. We have one in Clio. We have a partner up in Grand Traverse, Bird's Foot Native Nursery. And now we're starting one in Marquette, just because we know that there's an importance up there. And I like going to Marquette and bringing plants, but it's a long drive and it makes a very long day. So we'll be talking about that as we move along. And so this is extremely important to me. It's a passion with me. Prairies have been a passion, and the whole idea of native plants, grasses, have kind of fallen right in place with that passion. So without any delay, we can start getting into the presentation.
Great. And I just want to say one thing. Thank you. I'm monitoring the question and answers now, but one thing I did not mention earlier was we will be doing a drawing for a door prize of I believe it was a butterfly
Butterfly garden.
kit. And so I'll follow up with the winner. I have a list of who's logged on, and I'm going to take those attendees, and then I'll do a random drawing from the folks who attended this afternoon. So I just wanted to mention that.
So this is just an overview of where we're at. I only have my cell phone on there now because the house phone constantly rings, and I'm not in the house hardly ever. And so we don't get to see it until about 11 o'clock at night, and it just becomes an extra burden. So the cell phone is what we use a lot. We just now came up with the website also. You can get a hold of us at designsbynature@hotmail.com or designsbynaturellc.com for the website. So for some of you, this may look familiar. It's the cultural guide that is from the Prairie Moon catalog. And this is extremely important information for anybody who wants to know about wildflowers. This thing is, the one that I have on the screen right now is about 10, maybe 11 years old. And it has morphed into something that is a very usable tool as far as understanding all about the native plants. It goes into some specifics as far as comments go, that the plant may be aggressive, or it may spread by rhizome, or it may spread by rhizome and be aggressive at the same time. It goes into a wetland category. It also gives a germination code, which is important. We can talk about that quickly. And then also with the moisture, not just the moisture itself, but the moisture range of that plant. We play with that a lot. And so we want to use as many of the natives in our gardens as we possibly can. And there's no reason why I can't take something that is like a cardinal flower and plant it in the garden and actually get it to survive and flower. And we do that even in sand, but we have to live within the limitations of what the water capabilities of that plant are. And so in the case of cardinal flower, we put it in the garden, but we put it on the south side with a shrub on the opposite side of it. So it's not getting pure sunlight the whole time where the sun's beating down on it. And then we mulch it with 3 inches of, we use double ground pine bark, and that seems to be the best for maintaining moisture, holding up for a number of years, and then also returning some of the acid back to the soil that the plants need. We don't water our gardens. Yes.
Yeah. Quick question. Is this from the Prairie Moon catalog?
This is the Prairie Moon catalog, their
Okay.
cultural guide. So if I were to recommend a document for anybody, it would be get on their mailing list for a catalog every year. It's nice. They've changed it to where now it's more oriented to homeowners. They get to see what the flowers look like, and then they now have started to shift to where they're selling plants online also. So it's growing. It's a big industry.
And we'll send a link to Prairie Moon's catalog in the follow-up email, so you'll all be able to see it.
So, I mean, Prairie Nursery out of Wisconsin also has the same kind of cultural guide, but it's different. They categorize their plants by soil types. So I like the Prairie Moon. I've worked with them several occasions, but I've watched them adapt with this cultural guide, and it becomes a source document. If you want to sit down, you could plant an entire garden over the winter just by the information that is on that plant in that cultural guide. It gives you the amount of light that it needs. It gives you the height, the color, and then the bloom time and how long that bloom time is. And then it stresses the scientific name. We don't usually refer to plants by their common names when we go to market them, just because on one part of the state, we may have gray-headed coneflowers. On the other half of the state, it could be the yellow coneflower, and up in the UP, it could be tall coneflowers. And so common names change based on where you go. We always go to the scientific name. It also tells us if it's going to be a cultivar. We kind of shift away from the cultivars and try to stick with the natives. And in doing so, the scientific name kind of defines if it's a cultivar, because generally you'll see a genus and a species. And then if there's a third name attached to it and it's in quotes, then that tells you that that plant's been cultivated. Like Black-Eyed Susan, the Sunbeam. So it'll be Rudbeckia hirta with Sunbeam in quotes at the end. So it automatically tells you that you're getting something that's not truly native. Then one more thing that they do, they give you the number of seeds there are in an ounce. And so that's important to know, especially if you're going to do a planting in your backyard just using seed. Like Black-Eyed Susans, there's 92,000 seeds in 1 ounce. So that would put 2 plants for every square foot in an acre. So you just need to use that in the planting process so that you can save money for one, and then not completely saturate an area with just one species, wasting time and wasting money. So why natives? In Michigan, we see that they can adapt to almost anything the state can throw at it as far as the weather goes. We get the February warm-ups. We thought we were getting them. This time it was a January warm-up. And then you get the changing temperature where now it starts freezing again. Well, the cultivars don't handle that very well. The natives do. We can also see that they're not aggressive, but they can outcompete weeds if you get it done properly. And they do require a lot less maintenance. Just for one reference, we never water our wildflower gardens, and we always get a drought throughout the year. And so we never ever water them, and they still do just fine. In the prairie plantings that we have done, we now can get a prairie established in less than 2 years, and that is kind of unheard of. We go in first and we look at the site, we make sure that we know what we're dealing with, like spotted knapweed or mullein or some of the other invasives that are out there that have completely taken over the area. And so now we go in, assess that site first, we look at the soils, we look at the pH of that soil, and then we plant what we think is the right thing to do first, and that is the grasses, get the grasses established. Then after a period of time, we start to introduce the forbs. And we do that to kind of match the biology of the plant. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. But you can see that the extensive root systems of the grasses can actually filter out a lot of nutrients and a lot of moisture they can absorb. They don't require fertilizers. They don't require pesticides. And the tests that we've seen through several states is that they don't even interfere with agricultural tiles. There's some thoughts that perhaps they're going for that constant temperature water of 55 degrees that's very deep. And so they're not going to go after that warm water that is through even on residential drain tiles. They can take the carbon out of the air and put it back into the ground instead of into like the trunk of a tree or in the stalk of the other plant materials. But they fix the carbon into the ground instead of just releasing it after it dies. They provide tremendous number of wildlife benefits, and those are protection for winter cover and nesting and resting areas. We find that a lot of the insects use them. The bees will use some of the clumps. The butterflies use them for cover during storms. And the most important thing is that they provide escape from predators for a lot of the critters. And you can see that now we've even done some research on the grasses and how they provide nutrients for foragers. The only problem is switchgrass becomes an issue for sheep and horses because it's toxic. It has a toxin in it that can injure that as a food source. So depends on what the purpose is. We can put a warm season pasture in by using big blue stem, and it works perfectly. So Doug Tallamy has a book, and I think we put a reference out for all the books that we recommend. But Bringing Nature Home really does bring together the importance of the native plants, where we have native plants, insects, and critters. And we'll just talk about songbirds, is that when the native plants go away, the insects go away that support those critters. And then when the insects go away, the critters go away. And only the generalists end up using those habitats, and those generalists aren't the ones that we usually want in our areas. And so we can establish the native plants. The insects then know where the plants are. They find them just because of the sense that the plants put out, and then the critters can use the insects as a food source. So that critical link is there, and it's all tied together with native plants. And Talamy's book explains that tremendously. And then his second book also goes into the number of insects that are being used by songbirds, and also the habitat that can be created just in a small space within a neighborhood in the city that can assist butterflies or pollinators. So it's becoming a big issue now, to where the native plants are something that are critical to the entire ecosystem, and they're just kind of getting phased out. So that's why we're trying to push these along. So most states have a pre-settlement vegetation map that they can look at. Michigan wasn't a prairie state, but we had 2.3 million acres of prairie in Michigan. It could have been wet prairies, it could have been savannas, and just open grasslands. But you can see on the map that they were spread out in certain pockets, and even up in the UP, we had prairies. And so those grasslands were important at the time. And so since the settlement and since there was no management of these areas, we've lost 99% of those, that acreage. And so now we used to put a big push on a number of wetlands that we've lost 50% in Michigan, and the critters that were associated with those wetlands. But now if you look at the grasslands, and 99% of those grasslands are gone, that has a tremendous burden on the wildlife. And so we see a lot of species that are threatened and endangered that are tied directly to these grassland pockets. This is always a good slide to show, because it demonstrates the capabilities of the root systems of a lot of these plants. If you look at the scale, it goes down to 15 feet. And so several of them are well in excess of 9-10 feet deep. On the bottom left, or the top left corner, you'll see the little tiny growth, and that's the bluegrass. That's the lawns that we normally put in. And why we bring this up is because of the root structure itself. On a prairie that's established, it can absorb 7.5 inches of rain per hour, where a lawn can only absorb a 1/2 inch of rain per hour. So if we get a 3-inch rain, which is a typical rain during the summer in Michigan, then 2.5 inches of rain is going to run off of that lawn and then end up somewhere. Whatever it has, that lawn has on it, that water is going to take with it. So all the pesticides, all the fertilizers, the pelletized fertilizers will all run off and into the drain systems and then quickly into our streams. As opposed to the prairie, which can absorb that total number of rain level that falls, and it's amazing what it can do. It recharges the groundwater, because now you're getting this water percolating down into the ground, and then the groundwater is recharged. But if you look at the lawn, it's not recharging the groundwater. It's actually displacing that water, getting it out of the area as quick as possible, and then into the streams. There's a texture to these grasses. There is a mixture of height and color and texture to the grasses and the flowers together. And you can see that the diversity above ground is also occurring below ground. The grasses have deep penetrating roots that are fibrous. And so they kind of help keep the soil intact. At the same time, they're filtering out all these nutrients, but then you see that the flowers are penetrating deeper and deeper and deeper. And so it's a diversity in complex below ground as it is diversity and complexity above ground. So on the top left photo is a remnant prairie that we have that we used to monitor quite often when I was with the DNR. And it's a little blue stem. There was quite a few different forbs that were in this mix, but there's very little management done to this. And you can see that there's starting to be trees that are encroaching on it. On the right side is the installed prairie. This is one where we started with just grasses, and then we targeted the terrain to take a look at where we should put the flowers. And so all of the flowers are along the crests of the hills, and you can see that that is starting to come up. The bottom left corner, we use them in garden designs. The wildflowers are very attractive if done right, and they can also be a formal garden or a random garden. It depends on how you want to approach this. And then we can take a look at depressions and use those instead of just letting the lawn hold pools of water. We put in rain gardens. And I believe the city of Westland had actual rain gardens that were all interconnected that eventually went into the Rouge River, and the water was cleaned up quite a bit by the time it got there. Anybody who's worked with habitat in the past, you can see the difference on this with there's little blue stem on the stubble, the brown grass that's left. This is back in April. It's still standing after winter. On the right side is the brome fescue, where there's absolutely no cover for any critter that's there. And so it's just a good example of what can happen when a prairie is put in. So it's offering optimum cover against predators and shelter at the same time. And then you take a look at the brome, it's flat as a pancake. So if a bird does get out there, it's going to get nailed. Critter gets out there, it's going to get nailed by a predator. Thermal protection, middle of winter, these are all pheasants.
Hey, Vern. I don't know if this is the right time to bring it up, but I had a question about a septic field. If you need to be careful about planting where there's an existing septic field because of the root structure.
Yes, there is an approved septic mix that Department of Natural Resources from Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan has approved that can be put right over top of a septic drain field to reduce the amount of constant mowing over that drain field because of the nutrients and the water that's there. It requires more than just maybe a weekly mowing. And so there are several different mixes, and you can get those off of the websites from the DNR. You can see the thermal protection. This is switchgrass, and it's an area that was planted specifically for pheasants, and the pheasants weren't planted, they just came. And so it's good winter cover, and it's good thermal protection, and definitely cover from predators. So we look at site preparation. It's one of the most important parts of any planting. We actually go into a lot of basic stuff that we should be doing with every garden, but specifically with the wildflowers and the grasses. So we look at soils, we look at the pH, and what we're shooting for is a pH range of 5.5 to 6.5. That's perfect for any plant, any wildflower or grass. There are some that can go outside of those ranges, but for the most part, that's a good range to shoot for. If we don't have the 5.5 to 6.5, we can amend the soil, just like farmers always do, with ammonium sulfate or with other additives that could change that pH. And you can go right to the website and you can say, change your pH from 8.2 to 5.5, and it'll tell you exactly what needs to be added, and then you can mix that in. We also take a look at the color of the soil. So when we go down to getting this, selecting this site, I'll take a sample of the soil in my hand, and I'll try to form it into a ball. First off, that ball will then tell me if it has any clay in it. If it forms a nice ball, then that's fine. It's got some clay. If it doesn't, it just crumbles, then it's probably mostly sand. The color tells me if it's black, I probably have some organic material in it. So there's nutrients in it. If it's white, there's probably devoid of nutrients. So I want to look at that. And then I take that sample of sand and I squeeze it between my finger and my thumb, and I try to make a ribbon out of it. That ribbon should be about 3/4 of an inch. If it breaks off at that point, then you have a perfect mixture of a loam, a sand, a silt, and maybe a gravel or some kind of other material. But if it keeps going and it's like 2 foot long, it's probably all clay. There's a good chance of it. And then I will take a sample of that soil, wet it down, and run it between my fingers. And if I feel that it's silt and slippery, then that means it's got that silt in it that will plug the drainage of that soil, and then it will hold water longer. And then the other thing is it would hold nutrients longer. And so if in testing that, I now see that I've got a soil that's a perfect loam, or I got a soil that's all clay, now I know what plant I can put there. I put the right plant in the right place. And so you can look the plants up to tell what kind of soil it uses right out of the cultural guide, or you can just look that plant up online and it'll tell you the kind of soil that it takes. We do this all the time. I look at lighting, I look at moisture levels, I look at slope, but I really concentrate on existing vegetation. Anymore, we're having more and more problems with invasives or aggressive plants that we don't necessarily want in there. And some of the key ones are Canada thistle, spotted knapweed, and quackgrass. Those are 3 that just in particular are really a problem plant to get rid of. So when we want to remove that vegetation on a site, we do it with fire or we do it with cultivation. And when we cultivate, we don't cultivate more than 2 inches. Any more than that, then we start bringing up things like seeds that have been deposited there and stay there for a long, long period of time. Like velvet leaf is good for 100 years. So if I dig down a foot and I bring it to the surface, then I'm going to see all of that come back in. And then we use herbicides also. We don't use restricted use. We use a general purpose or something that is easily attainable and it doesn't require special use permits, okay? Or we do a combination of all 3. As far as using fire to clear the ground up, blacken it, we'll let things grow just to green up. Then we may treat it with a 2% solution or 3% solution of a general purpose pesticide, herbicide. And then we'll cultivate it, we'll let it green back up, and then we'll treat it one more time. The more site prep I put into a site, the more success I'm going to have. At that same time, we also establish a planting date. And we'll just say it's the 15th of May. That means that 2 weeks prior to that, I need to be doing something. I need to be either prepping the soil, I need to be doing herbicide application, or I need to be cultivating it so that I'm not trying to do it all the day before I go to plant, because it's going to end up being a mess. Okay.
Hey, Vern, quick
Yes.
question kind of related to that. Ginger is asking if it's possible to establish a native garden surrounded by farmland that is maintained by aerial spraying, kind of related to the pesticide herbicide question.
You can. The problem comes in now where the agricultural areas are using neonicotinoid pesticides. And so it's going to have a large impact on the insects, tremendous impact on the insects. So that's the issue with that. The farmers are liable for any drift that comes off from pesticide or herbicides that they use. And so they know better than that. That doesn't mean that they don't, but they have to take into account the wind, the temperature, and the potential drift on what that herbicide can do. And if anything happens, then they're liable for all of that. So.
Do you have any specific recommendations for herbicides for prepping?
So glyphosate is a good one. All right. So glyphosate, and I don't buy any herbicide from Lowe's or Home Depot. I get it from where the farmers get it, because that's the only way that I can guarantee that I'm going to get what I should get. If I get it from Home Depot and Lowe's, then it's going to be in such low concentrations that, and it's going to have things in it that maybe I don't want to use, like the Roundup Extend has a pesticide in it that is long lasting and will kill plants for a long period of time. And so you want to read the small print and make sure you're not throwing something like that on it. If it says on the label, do not plant anything for 3 months after applying this, that ought to tell you something, that it's going to have some kind of a residual pesticide in it. Okay. And so I generally use a glyphosate compound, and it works fairly well. If I want to isolate where I spray it, because you are going to get some kind of drift and overspray, then I make a solution and I put on a rubber glove, and then I put on a cloth glove. I dip my hand in that solution, wring it out, and I just touch the things I wanted to kill. It's called the glove of death, and it works very well. That way you don't get any overspray, you don't get any off-target damage to the plants, and it doesn't transfer into the ground and onto other things. Okay. I put this slide up because this is one, when I do a prairie restoration or a large planting, I'll go to this web soil survey that NRCS puts out. And you can actually take your property and expand it so it's in this box that now it tells you what the soil makeup is, the percent soil that is on this property within this targeted box. And then if you see the blue lines, those are water systems that are there, and the dotted lines are underground water systems. It's really usable. I mean, it's a very good tool because there are some tiles that were put in back in the 30s that they still have records of. And then if they do it right, the satellite imagery comes up, it can actually show some of these underground tiles, especially during the early spring. And so that's something that's good to have in your back pocket. Just a nice little makeup of what the soils are. So it's a useful tool. It's not hard to use, it's not hard to get to. If I can do it, trust me, anybody can do it. So when we look at selecting a site for landscaping, we need to take in the light of the site you're going to plant. So if this is a house in the middle of an area, or it's a hill, or it's a tree line, it's all got the same type of light conditions. Like in Michigan, we have a southern aspect sun. So on the north side of this feature, we're going to have areas where it's going to be early morning sun and late afternoon sun, and that's it. So we put our shade in our water gardens there. Our shade plants can be anything that goes from a woodland shade to just trillium and jacks and all those special plants. Water gardens don't sit out in the sun and do very well. It usually becomes a chemistry experiment because you're constantly testing the water, constantly refilling it, constantly trying to change the pH and get it to within reason. And so putting them on the north side of the feature is going to be the best. On the east side, we still have some shade. We've got early morning light that's not as hot. So you can get away with more shade gardening on the eastern side of the feature. And you can put a filtered light garden. I've grown trillium on the east side of the house. I've grown Jack in the Pulpits also. And all of the woodland species I can put there without worrying too much about them getting too hot. Now, when we start moving to the southern part of the house, then we're going to have constant sun. And the butterflies in my full sun gardens are the best location for those because butterflies are cold-blooded, and so they need to warm up. And so these are good locations for them. And then on the west side, that one is even more special because the sun, when it hits the west side of the house, it's already at its highest temperature, the peak of the day. And so it beats down on that west side and that radiates down into the garden area. So usually you'll see the garden will start growing sooner on the west side of the house. Not so much in the south, but on the west side of the house because of that radiating sun. And then the specialty gardens, more butterflies because they need it, and then other dry loving and warm loving gardens. So just take this into perspective when you're thinking and planning these out. So when we do a butterfly garden, we want to try to attract as many of these critters as possible. And we're going to concentrate on monarchs because they most recently were placed on, they're very close to be putting on the endangered species list. And all of it is because of changes in habitat along the migratory routes and within the cities and the countryside, the lack of their primary food source, and that is the milkweed. And it doesn't have to be common milkweed. We have about 4 or 5 milkweeds in Michigan that we can use. The more milkweeds you can include, the bigger the palette, the bigger the diversity of plants that are out there for these monarchs to find. Remember, they can find a milkweed before it even blooms out in the middle of a prairie, because these plants will put out a pheromone that the monarchs can find, and they seek these milkweeds out and can lay their eggs as soon as they can find it. It doesn't have to be blooming to do so. And then when we start putting things together, we just don't build the garden just for butterflies, because we realize that pollinators are going to use it. So in order to reduce the amount of time that a butterfly sits on a plant or bounces from plant to plant, we try to use species that have lots of little florets in them. So the liatris, the bergamots, the bonesets, the lead plant. You can see that it's set up with some diversity, and we try to set it up with clusters of these plants. And if we try to follow the guidelines of the Xerces Society, they're looking for 3 to 5 foot circles of the same species and a minimum of 10 different species within the garden. So that serves both the butterflies, and it also serves the pollinators. So they don't have to fly from plant to plant anymore. They can fly, land on a liatris, and then spend most of their time just walking along the plant instead of flying from each one. So this is just a breakout, and we try to pick something that goes from early spring until late fall. So we're going to get the early spring bloomers, the ragworts, some of the petunias, and then we move all the way into the lupin, and then we move all the way into the summer plants, and then we go into the fall, the asters and the goldenrods. Here's a good rain garden design if you choose to do that. I like to make my rain gardens 3 foot in the center, and then we go out from there. In order to figure how big of an area that you need, you have to bring in the volume of a hemisphere, 2/3 pi r squared times the height. And so if you take a surface area, like say a 20 by 40 roof, and you get a 3-inch rain, so that's 800 square feet of water. 3 inches is 1/4 of a foot, and so we end up with figuring out that we need to hold the number of cubic feet in that rain garden. And so if you put it into that formula, you'll be able to figure out what the radius of that circle has to be. And then once you figure that radius, then you can dig out the soils, make sure it's level, and then you start with the taller stuff in the center and the shorter stuff on the outside. One thing that I don't agree with on the bottom left corner of this is that we don't amend the soils for native plants. This was basically set up for using cultivars. And so we don't add compost to the site. That's just an added expense. And the nutrient level in that soil then is increased, which then creates more competition for the natives because they don't use the nutrients, the nitrogen, at the same rate as other plants do. We don't put masonry sand in. That's another added expense. We match the plant to the soil type. When we bring the water in from the source, whether it be a roof or whether it be a driveway, then we can either bring it direct from a downspout and then a weeper tile into the garden, At the entrance, we usually put some stone in front of it to kind of deflect some of that water. And then we put some switchgrass or another grass component that will kind of diffuse that water as it enters the garden. We can also make a little rivulet out of the rainwater that comes down and just bring it into the garden by making a serpentine rivulet, so it's not a straight shot. And then that way, the water slowed down. Some of it actually absorbs into the ground, but then the rest of it that overflows goes into the pool. If we don't have an area that's big enough for one big garden, then we make a series of them and we tie them together so that we can then take in all of that water and displace it into the gardens. We always put an overflow pipe just in case it gets more than a 3-inch rain. So it does blow out, and then that's where you could put 2 or 3 of them in tandem. So you could handle all the rain.
Vern, what formula did you use for the rain garden?
It's the volume of a hemisphere, 2/3 pi r squared times the height.
And what is a rain garden, where is a rain garden best to be used? Northwest or along a coast? It
can be anywhere. It's usually when you look out in the spring and you see depressions where there's standing water, that's a perfect area to put a rain garden, especially if you have a lawn that you're mowing around it and that becomes an issue. Then you can put a rain garden in that site, and now the water won't pool there. It'll pool in a rain garden, the plants will use it up, and now you have a habitat, a butterfly garden or a pollinator garden, in addition to that being a rain garden. That make sense? Okay. When we plant larger areas, we use seed just because it's less expensive to do so. Takes a little bit longer, but you can stage it out over a period of time. When we initially talked about the prairies, because of the number of invasives, and like we had a good example of one up in the northern part of the state, near Northport. It was 100 acres. It was spotted knapweed that was 5 foot tall. So we knew right away that we could initially go in, take care of the spotted knapweed, but there was so much seed deposited in that area that that was going to be an issue. We're going to have to deal with that for a long time. So just in planting the grass seed, we would end up disturbing enough soil that would bring up some of the spotted knapweed seed. So that was our target. We're going to plant the grasses. We're then going to use a broadleaf herbicide to take care of the spotted knapweed as it came in. And usually the guide was, once the grasses are past the 3 to 5 leaf stage, then it's safe to apply a broadleaf herbicide to it without injuring the grasses. And so we would do that, and we may have to put 2 or 3 attempts at spraying just because of the total number of plants that were there from the very beginning. And then as the grasses continue and they are established, now we go back in and we start to introduce the flowers. We don't introduce the flowers until the fall because the majority of the plants require stratification. Most of the wildflowers require stratification, which is they have to be at 38 degrees for X number of days before they will break dormancy in order to develop. So some of them require 120 days. There's a few that require 90 days, some that require 70, a lot of them that require 60 days, and then a good number of 30 days. There's only a handful that require no stratification. Bergamot's one of them, horsemint's another one, and there's no stratification whatsoever, so you can get away with it. But if you take all of your grass seed and you plant it, and then you come right back and you plant all your wildflower seed right following right after it, it's going to have to sit there until it gets stratified. And so over that course of time, if it's sitting there too long, then critters are going to get it. It's going to get wet and mold at different times of the year until it gets the right conditions in order to germinate. So it's best to hold off and do it and follow the biology of the plant. And so that's what we're doing. And then what we'll do is introduce plugs of the harder to grow species or harder to find, and we just put those into small colonies and just go randomly throughout the prairie planting. And then the ones that are really unique, then we'll put them in as gallon pots, and we'll do that maybe as year 3, year 4. Something so we can stage it out. So plugs are 2 inches around and 4 inches deep. They come 38 to a flat. They're quicker growing, and they've already gone through stratification, and they've gone through the test of, because they're getting warmth, they're getting water, and they're not getting any fertilizer because we don't fertilize the plants when they're the native plants. And so many of them will bloom that first year. And then you get this establishment of a plant much sooner. They're a little more expensive, and we use them on medium-sized projects. Sometimes we will combine plugs with the seed, just so that we can show some growth and some development right away. And then people like to see that. And then the next year, then they start seeing the seed that was planted. Quartz, they're just like any other quart. They're mature plants. What's nice to do with quartz is you just set the quart out where you want it, and then step back and see if that's how you want your garden to look. And then you just plant. A rule of thumb for spacing, we plant 1 wildflower per square foot. This is just a rule of thumb, and 1 grass for every 3 square feet, because they're going to get much bigger. Either they spread out as a clump, or they get taller and spread out. Normally, a mixed prairie is 70% grasses and 30% wildflowers, but when we do a planting around a residential area, we flip-flop that. We still want the grass component, so we want 30% grasses and 70% wildflowers, because we want the boom of the color. We still want the grasses there for cover and for texture and diversity. And so if I have an area that's 100 square feet, then 30% of that planting is going to be grasses. And so I would need, if I'm going to plant 1 grass for every 3 square feet, then I need 10 grasses in that planting. And then I need 70 wildflowers. So that's something that you can just sit and figure out. Planting them 1 every square foot is, it's a tight garden. It helps keep out the competition and any weeds that may blow in. And it really looks good. And it kind of fits in with all of those recommendations like the Xerces Society gives, as far as 3 to 5 foot circles for plants for the pollinators to go to. So we'll go in, we'll select the site, we'll prep it and get it ready to go. We'll do the soil testing to make sure that it's what we desire. And then we plant the garden with the taller stuff in the back. Or if it's a circle garden, we put the taller stuff in the center, and then we span it out to where the shorter stuff's in front, where we can see it. The recommendations that we're seeing now on monarch gardens is that they would like to see the milkweed on the outside of the garden. So it's the first thing that is approached by the monarchs. If it's inside and it's being covered up, then it's more difficult for the monarch to get to it. And so they would recommend that they put it on the outside of the garden. The other thing that I'm finding out is that if I put a milkweed in an area and I don't offer any protection, like a shrub or some kind of a structure, then the caterpillars, when they go to form a chrysalis, they will go onto a fence, they'll go onto a bench, and just before they start to emerge, the mice come up at night and they will feed on the chrysalis. So all that work that they put into doing this, and now they get eaten by a mouse because there was no cover. So what we're doing now is we start to introduce things like New Jersey tea as the structure plant. And we'll put maybe 2 or 3 of those into a cluster, and then we plant our milkweeds around the outside of it. And what we're finding is that when the caterpillars go to form a chrysalis, you can't find them unless you start to pull that New Jersey tea apart, and then you can see that they form the chrysalis inside. So they've got some protection now from predators. And it's a good plant to use because It serves as a host plant. It's a good pollinator, and then it becomes the protection from predators for the caterpillars. Maintenance. You're going to have to do some on a native planting, but we do much less. If we've done our site prep right, then we're going to have very few weeds to deal with. The reason that I like to use the double ground pine bark, and it's double ground red pine bark, and I put 3 inches on, is because when a weed does blow in from a seed, it's easy to pull it out because it doesn't have a base to tie into. And so you can easily pull those weeds out before they become a big problem. You're not out there weeding all the time. You may just go and kind of visit your garden, and then you see something that's not supposed to be there, you pull it out. It's not a problem. So we monitor the weeds for development periodically. We remove the litter in the spring by either mowing it, burning it, or weed whipping it. And we do this in the early spring before green up. And so what that does is it gives cover throughout the fall, cover throughout winter, and food sources, because all those seeds become foods for the bird. And then the cover is also the birds get into those clumps and the clusters, and they get out of harm's way during the winter. On larger plantings, though, we only take care of 1/3 of the litter at a time. So it's a sequence over a 3-year period of 1/3 of it's going to get some kind of maintenance done to it. And we'll do the same. We'll either mow 1/3 of it, or we'll mow it down and just burn that stubble. And then we could weed whip it and burn that stubble, or we just mow it and then rake the stubble off and get rid of it. The reason that we want to do that is because there's some critters that like no stubble. There's some critters that like a little bit of stubble, and some critters that like a lot of stubble. But if I let that stubble, that thatch, build up over too long of a period, that thatch then becomes an insulator for the ground. Yes, it's still providing some kind of cover, but what you'll start seeing is the plants will start becoming shorter and shorter. And then they'll flower, but they won't have enough time to get pollinated and form seed, because the thatch is insulating the ground, and it's basically keeping the ground colder longer than it normally would in the spring. And then you're reducing the growing season for that plant. So removing that thatch is important. The other thing about doing 1/3 of the time, 1/3 of it at a time, is because now you're reducing your amount of maintenance. And second, and probably most important, is there are some critters like prairie mantises and some spiders that stay in those areas and lay their egg casings in there. If I got rid of it all, then I'm going to get rid of all those preferred predators, okay, of other insects.
Vern, when you say litter, what are you specifically talking about, and does that include mulch?
No, not the mulch, just the remaining stuff that's left over from that plant, that thatch that's left over. So I can weed whip it right to the ground, and then I can remove that litter. Okay. I can change the species that comes into my site by how I plant it and the kinds of materials that I put in. So in this case, you can see that when there is a vegetation height that is high, or the moisture level is changing, or the fire intensity is changing, that I can change and bring all kinds of different species in. So if I have a vegetation density on the left that shows that it's sparse and very short, then I'm going to get killdeer or critters that only need just a little bit of cover. But as I get into the wider diversity of species, then I can increase that vegetation density and the vegetation height and moisture level, and I'll get more critters that use it. And I think this next one shows that. This is with shrub density. So if I have no shrubs, and I have a 50-50 grass to flower ratio, I'm not going to get a lot of critters in there, except when I start playing with the variances as far as what those ratios are. So the more diversity I have, the more diversity in species I'm going to bring in. Prairies, And wildflower stands were always based with using fire, because the fire removes the litter, it sets back the succession, and it increases soil temperature. It also gets rid of a lot of those seeds that were deposited from a lot of the weeds that were there. By the time that the seeds hit the surface of these wildflower plants, they're into the ground by then. Whereas the winter seeds like mare's tail blows in, it lays on the surface, and then it does what it does best. So we do spring and fall burns. We don't do just a spring burn or just a fall burn, because those burns are going to favor one type of habitat over another. If I constantly do spring burns, I'm going to favor grasses. If I constantly do fall burns, I'm going to favor the wildflowers. So I'll see a reduction in the grasses, or else in the spring, if I just do burns, then I will see an increase in the grasses, a reduction in the flowers. We always set up fire breaks. We always attain permits, and we have a burn plan. If you don't know what you're doing, it's best not to do this. There are companies that can come in and do these kind of burns for you. You don't have to burn, you just have to get the thatch out. But remember, the fire then leaves the ground black. The sun hits that, it absorbs that sunlight and warms that ground up sooner, and it all starts the process much quicker by doing so. If I leave that thatch there, then it's going to insulate that ground, and then it's going to delay everything coming up. In Michigan,
hey, Vern,
oh, go ahead. I'm
sorry. I just want to check in. We've got less than 30 minutes left,
okay,
and we've got probably 26 to 30 questions.
Okay.
So I just wanted to.
Okay.
Great.
So in Michigan, we have a state fire council that you can go to, and they give all the people who can do burns for you. So you don't have to worry about that. Weed competition is always a problem. These are the ones that are the issues: reed canary grass, bull thistle, mare's tail, and smooth brome and quackgrass. They're going to be things that you can't get rid of them. Spotted knapweed, Canada thistle, the white cockle, autumn olive. You're going to need to use a herbicide on them. I know people are hesitant to do so, but it's something that you can't dig these out. You just cannot dig them out and get rid of them. It's just labor intensive, and they'll keep coming back. And a lot of these plants, like spotted knapweed, will put a toxin in the soil, and it's probably worse than the chemicals you can get. It's got a carcinogen in it. So it's just the smart thing to do. Here is a non-native planting, and when you walk through it, there's very little there. It's a desert. This is in one of our city parks, and they constantly work on this, just constantly, to keep things out of it, like weeds, just so that it looks pretty. But you don't see a lot of critters using it, not at all. However, these are big deals. These are all different kinds of gardens, to include kids' gardens, shade gardens. On the bottom left corner, somebody who had a 10-acre grass area, a lawn that he mowed every day and had to water and had to fertilize, and just to keep it going, got rid of almost all of it, put a prairie in, and now he enjoys it much more. He has time to actually enjoy it. Just to quickly go over some of the plants, these are the grasses. They're important features of the planting, even in a garden that you you plant around your home, because they give you that texture that you need. A lot of the wildflowers, goldenrods, we pick the ones that don't spread by rhizome. So the things like showy goldenrod and hairy goldenrod and even stiff goldenrod, they don't take over everything. The plants that are a little more aggressive, like bergamot, it's in the mint family, so it can tend to spread. So we surround it with other plants to stop it from spreading, and it works. If I put a black-eyed Susan in the middle of your garden and there's nothing else there, in 3 years, it's going to be nothing but black-eyed Susans. So you just need to plant it nice and tight, and then everything will be fine. These are some of the others that we can use. And brownleaf ragwort for us in Michigan, that's one of the first flowers that blooms when the monarchs return. So when this starts popping up, we know that it's very soon the monarchs are going to be back. And it's one of their initial food sources, nectar sources. Everybody thinks that turtlehead is a wet species and irises are wet species. They are, but they will also grow in your garden without any additional watering. We have we have 4 silphiums in Michigan. 3 of them are threatened or species of special concern. 1 isn't. The prairie dock is not special, or it's special, but it's not threatened or species of special concern. Just some more ideas for different plants that can be used. We have been branching out and trying to develop plants that are threatened and endangered. And so we've been working with the Fish and Wildlife Service as far as growing out pitcher's thistle for them. We get the seed. They collect it, they give us the seed, we grow them out, they put the plants into restored habitat in the fall, and it works like a champ. The bottom one is prairie smoke. Everybody likes that. It's a spring bloomer, and it's a good one to use. It's an evergreen. And the top left corner is the dwarf lake iris, which is the state wildflower of Michigan. Just a teaser of some woodlands. Most of the trillium are protected, and so therefore we can only get them if they're rescued. And that whole rescue program is difficult to come by because you have to have coordination with the landowner and at the same time a team to be able to dig them up at the right time. So before the ground is even either turned into a driveway or a house where they just get plowed under. But we actually can go out and collect those, get them inspected, and then make them available. But there's a wide range. Yes.
Vern, will you have, so some of these species you don't have on the pre-order list that we've offered. Are you going to bring some of these more unique items to the Native Plant Expo?
So we grow about 100 different wildflowers, and we don't offer them all because we don't have the numbers that we can offer statewide. So what we do as a teaser is when we have the sales, we always bring woodlands that we don't often find. And then we'll maybe have 15, 20 of them, and it's usually first come, first serve. That way we can share them with the entire state instead of just one sale. I think we have some listed on our website this year to include a woodland shade garden that has 2 trillium in it, 2 jacks, and a whole wide range of woodland wildflowers. And you can check that out on our website. Ferns are a good one too, as far as planting, especially on that north side of the house. Everybody likes the woodland phlox because of the way they smell and they form a great ground cover. But all of these, we should have a good representation at all of the sales that we go to. So.
Excellent. All right. So I attempted to try to organize some of these questions, but there's a broad range. So I'm just going to ask you like a lightning round. Okay. How does that sound?
Yep.
Okay. And actually, why don't you stop sharing your screen and I'll share mine. It's got the website on there. And I'm gonna, so whatever questions we don't get to, what we'll do is I'm going to download these and I will try to just address either basic questions in the email that I'll provide afterwards to everybody. And if there's more specific in-depth questions, we'll follow up more specifically with you. It seems like everybody's really knowledgeable to start, which is great. So there's a lot of really good, interesting questions. I just wanted to, I did this again. I just wanted our website and information on there. Okay, here we go, lightning round. Let's see, do you ever use solarization or smothering to remove existing vegetation, especially non-native grasses?
We've tried it. We don't get warm enough temperatures to really do that good of a job in Michigan. Especially some of the species will grow outside of where we're doing it. And then as soon as we remove it, they come right back in. We've done the cardboard issue and that works fine, but then you can't plant into it. Even if you tear a hole, there's not enough moisture then that gets down into that area. And so it becomes an issue of having to remove the cardboard and then you're planting and you're just basically starting all over again. Or tearing it out from around the plants, and it doesn't work.
I've done that myself and had the same experience. I'm looking to transform a section of lawn that was normally cut a third of an acre. And should I get rid of the grass that was there or plant natives and let them take over? I plan to do a section of burns.
Okay, and so the depth of the thatch is what's going to be important. So you dig a section of that up, and if it's more than an inch thick of root system, you're going to have to till that up and break it up. Because you need seed soil contact in order for these things to grow. And so the grass works as a good mulch, but you got to get down into it. And so you got to kill that grass and then get into that mulch. You've done yourself a favor in mowing it because you've kept the weeds under control. You basically stopped them from going to seed, and so therefore you won't have as much of a problem with it, unless it's a real problematic species. Then you'll know that immediately as soon as you stop. Okay.
Great. And there's quite a few questions about different invasive species. Do you have to treat the invasives first, or are you suggesting that the grasses can outcompete them?
They can't outcompete them. And so you're going to have to go in. If you plant the grasses, you can still go through, and if it's a smaller area, you can use the glove of death on them, where you only treat that invasive. If you use the right stuff like Milestone, you can spray on grasses and it takes care of Canada thistle, and it takes care of most broadleaves, so where you won't have to injure the grasses. And that's why we promote planting the grasses first, so that you have more tools in your toolbox to go in and keep all of those nasty things out.
Speaking of grasses, someone has a question about, can you explain how you'd be able to get grasses established faster? Are you spraying with herbicide before sowing the seed?
So when we go in for site prep, yes, we try to do as much treatment. If I'm going to do a project that is a large area, then I will go and start treating in the fall. I'll get initial treatment in the fall to where I can get some of that under control. And then I try to, based on my planting date, get in there early to spray and treat the broadleaves that are coming in, or treat the grasses and broadleaves as they're coming in, because I may have reed canary grass in there. So I may need to treat more often in order to get that under control before I introduce the things that I'm trying to save or try to promote growing.
What would be the best to plant in very sandy soil with very little light? Thank you for sharing your knowledge.
With very little light, what does that mean? Early morning, late afternoon only?
I'm guessing shade.
Okay, so if it's shade, then bottle brush grass does extremely well. That grows in pure shade. There's several sedges you can use also. Pennsylvania sedge is a good ground cover that will grow in pure shade. Does extremely well. You don't have to mow it. You can, but it only gets maybe 6 to 8 inches tall at the most. But there are so many different sedges that could be used that are available. Okay.
This next one is close to my heart. How do you prevent new unwanted plant growth when using cultivation to prep an area, which lead to dormant seeds in the seed bank sprouting? I had personally 8-foot tall horsetail in my 4 acres that
Right.
I called Vern about because I was panicking. But how would you manage something like that?
So again, it depends on what the species is that you're going after. Mare's tail is or horsetail is a winter weed. So if there's fields of it nearby, it's going to blow over and it's going to come in, and you're going to have a difficult time getting it out of there. But if you plant your site tight enough, you can keep those things out. I mean, they won't be able to get a chance. And then you can go in and systematically mow it initially in order to keep them under control. You can mow the prairie grasses down to 2 to 3 inches and it doesn't hurt them. And you can do it maybe 2 or 3 times in a season and they will all come back because they will continue to grow a root system so that then they can explode when they do. We have a parking area that we mow once a week. And as soon as we stop parking, the little blue stem and the Indian grass just starts popping up because it's there.
Different type of invasive species, not really, but
Yeah.
this person has an overabundance of deer. What plants are resistant to deer?
There's several plants that the deer, they don't like things like onion. They don't like things that have prickly leaves. So they leave the silphiums alone. They leave nodding wild onion. They leave milkweed alone because of the texture of the leaf, but they do eat the pods. So when the plant forms its seed pod, that's what they feed on. And so they'll come through and they'll eat them. There are several things that you can spray on a garden, but that's a long time job because they just keep coming back all the time because once they learn something, they come back and do the same thing all over again. We had a doe that would bring in her 2 fawns, and all they ate was Queen Anne's lace. They wouldn't touch anything else. So we encourage those deer to come in. But when they start eating the things that you don't want, then that's not good. So what we've started doing is mixing the things they don't like into the garden, and then they tend to stay out. So when they step on a nodding wild onion or a leek, then that scent of the onion is really strong and it takes one of their scents away. And so they leave the area. They just get out of there. We have a nature center nearby that has probably 100 deer per acre. It's that bad. And so I couldn't figure out why there were trillium growing all along the edge of the stream bank and the deer were all there. And it was because there were nodding wild onion and leeks growing throughout the trillium. And they just left them alone because they didn't want to get into those. We've heard of putting dial soap out, on a stake, but that's just, you're going to have to keep doing it all the time. And so it's one of those things that you start looking for plants they don't eat.
Yeah.
And there are lists of deer resistant. Prairie Moon has got a perfect list of plants that are deer resistant. Okay.
I'll include that also in the email. Are the plants that are toxic to livestock also toxic to dogs? Button bush toxic to dogs. So basically, are there any that you can think of that would be toxic to domestic pets?
I'm not positive. I know that there are a few that are poisonous to humans and cattle, and probably the dogs also. And you just have to. You can look that plant up on the web, but anytime I do anything on the web, I look for consistency. I look at 5 or 6 or 10 different messages about a certain plant. And if I see the same thing popping up in all 10 of them, then I will consider that. But I'm not going to just take one that says my dog died because it ate a butterfly weed, and not how things usually progress. So you look at, because anything can happen on the internet.
Do you know if Prairie Moon lists toxicity as part of their cultural
I don't
workflow?
think they do, but it's with the internet now, you can find almost anything, and you just do enough of them so that you can see if it's consistent, and then tell whether or not you should use that plant or not.
I'll do a little digging around for that. Let's see here. Someone had a question about from Indiana who has very little soil and mainly sedimentary rock. Are there natives that can thrive with little soil?
Yes. And it's usually the grasses that start. In fact, we figured out there was a restoration project that we were working on down in Indiana, and it was on the soil that was compacted by that big machinery that they use in the mines in order to haul stuff out. It was packed down so tight that nothing would grow there. They tried planting into it, and it didn't work because they just didn't have the water source available. But all of a sudden, big blue stems started popping up in it. And it started to break up that hard pack, and then you started seeing things happen. So starting with the big blue stem or any of the prairie grasses, and then once those root systems are established, because they break the soil up and make it so that other plants can now get in there.
Interesting.
And that's
okay.
what we saw down at that project at that mine.
How about water table? Somebody said that their water table is about 4 feet. Will this be a hindrance? We are on a prairie in the lower Wisconsin River Valley. Soil where there is not sandy.
Okay. The plants will stop if they get to a point where there's too much water. Okay, so they'll grow, but then they'll start, just like a tree would, they'll start going lateral. But they're still going to produce the root systems that they need to. We've seen it where the plants hit a rock bed and can't get any deeper, and all they do is spread laterally. And so that's what I would consider. I think that would happen. And so you would pick the plants, like if it's going to be a real dense soil, you probably wouldn't go with little blue stem. You'd go something else that had a better root system, like prairie dropseed would. Because you can find that in a fen, which has higher water tables, and they can go up and down, but at the same time, it's one of those species that does just fine there.
How about some ideas for deep shade? Is that something that you have listed out on your website where people can kind of select for species that are
most of the woodlands that we have on the website are for deep shade. There are some that grow perfectly well right in the deep shade, like spikenard and the ginger, the baneberries do fine. And so there's all kinds of stuff that's out there. And so you just have to look to see what you want.
And our website, we updated this year. You can actually select for different characteristics, and it will come up with at least what we have available for pre-order for
there's so many tools out there.
Yeah. How about some alternatives to herbicides? Have you had success with non-toxic bio ones like clove oil, lactic acid, vinegar, others?
Some of those work, but they change the pH of the soil. It's like putting salt on it. Salt will change the pH of that soil. It will kill that plant, but now you got that salt that's still there, or you got the vinegar that's still there, that then you're putting acid on it to make it more acidic. So now you're adjusting that, and now it's going to open the door for something else. It depends on what the plant is. If it's just an annual, pulling it is not a big deal. That's easy. But when you have things that are perennials and really do a lot of damage, you almost have to use a herbicide, because your job is going to be doing nothing but pulling that. Canada thistle is a good example of that. My boss, told me when I was with the DNR, says, you don't have to worry about it. I mow the Canada thistle along my paths, and it doesn't go anywhere. It's gone. I don't find it anymore. But then he came back 3 months later and he says, but it's gone crazy inside where I didn't mow because it spread out laterally from the intense mowing. But when you look at the root system it has, it's lateral below ground, and if you burn it, it's stimulated. If you dig it up, it's stimulated unless you get 100% of the root. If you just have a little segment, it's a new plant. If you put Roundup on it, it stimulates it. So it has to be a specific herbicide, and that's where Milestone comes in handy. It's a good one for doing that. There's another one too. I'll have to think about it. But
so Milestone isn't glyphosate?
No, it's a different. It's aminopyrrolid, and it you're only putting 4 ounces per acre.
Okay.
That ought to tell you something about it, and it has a half-life that breaks down rather quickly. Something that folks should understand is that the herbicides that we would recommend aren't restricted use. They're not nasty, where you can't, they smell horrible and they have everlasting, half-lives on them. So we stay away from those things. Most homeowners can't get those anyway. And so what we look for are things that have a half-life of, say, 45 days. The things that break herbicides down are sunlight, bacteria, and temperature. So I have a warm day where the temperature of the soil goes up, the sunlight hits it for a long time, and that soil breaks, or that herbicide breaks down almost immediately. And there's some, like glyphosate, it's a negatively charged ion. So when it hits the ground, it binds with the soil. So it doesn't go everywhere. It stays right there where the soil is, and then it starts breaking down almost immediately.
Hopping around a little bit here. What do you think is the best time of year to do a soil test if you're going to plan a planting?
I'm going to do it in the fall, because that's when I'm going to start doing all my major planning anyway. And so when I do a good soil test, just so everybody knows they're consistent with it, is that you dig a hole about 1 foot deep, like with a post hole digger. And then you take a slice of that soil all the way to the bottom of that, and you put it in a bucket. You take about 5 or 6, 7 of those, put each one of those samples in that same bucket, mix it all up, and you take a cup over to the soil lab. You can run it through extension, and they'll take care of that too. And it's not very expensive. Sometimes those are paid for through the conservation districts. But then
we actually have a little video that our new conservation technician's gonna put together on how to do one at home, a little 10-minute clip. So we'll have that posted in the next few weeks.
And the other thing too is that before doing one around the house, you're gonna take the same kind of concept, that you're gonna take a good sampling of that soil, but then you can pick up a soil test kit at a garden shop, and they come with little tablets, and you can test the nitrogen, the phosphate, and the potassium level. You want low nitrogen levels because these plants don't use them. Mm-hmm. And then you want the higher P and K, because that will, give you more flowers, give you better root systems. And then you want to test for pH, but make sure you use distilled water when you do the test so you don't skew it.
Good tip. How about, do you have any suggestions on how to remove poison ivy before planting in an area?
Yeah, it's difficult, especially if it's in the summer, because once that leaf hardens off, you have to use something that gets down into that leaf. It can penetrate that waxy coating on the leaf. And so I was using Garlon 4 Ultra, and it does a wonderful job on poison ivy, on English ivy, on periwinkle, all of those nasty kind of plants. But anytime you use something like that, you got to make sure you know what you're doing as far as you read the label, you read what the percent rate is that you want to spray, and then follow all the PPEs that they recommend.
Excellent.
And don't do it when it's 100 degrees out and it's full sun, because the plants basically shut down when that happens. Then you can spray it with as much as you want, it's not going to kill them because they're not active. So early spring. If you want to do it later in the fall, you cut the plant away and let it come up again, and then treat the new emerged vegetation, and then it'll kill it.
Vern, we could talk to you for another 3 hours. What do you have going on after? Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time, but
Okay.
I promise, so we've got a recording here. We will share it as a follow-up along with all these resources that we've promised, along with the winner of our door prize of the butterfly kit. I just want to mention a couple of things before everyone leaves. Our website, www.washtenaw.org, has a ton of information, including details on the Native Plant Expo and Marketplace. We also, if you're interested in learning more about the critter aspect, the pollinator and butterfly aspect of native plants, Brenda Diedzik will be presenting on designing butterfly gardens using native plants on March 3rd. I believe that's at 6:30 p.m. It will be hosted on the same platform. It will be a webinar, and we will also be doing a door prize of her book. I believe it's titled Butterflies in the Garden, but she'll also be at the Native Plant Expo as well. We will follow up again with all of your questions, and please take a moment to answer the 10-question survey that we'll send out with the email. It will help us to improve our webinar and our educational offerings and come up with some more interesting topics to provide to you guys in the future. Thank you again, Vern, for everything and coming out to Ann Arbor to present.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thanks for everybody for coming and attending this. This is great. The more we get out to people, the better it's going to be. Excellent.
So we look forward to seeing you in June.
Yes.
With our native plants in tow. Thanks again, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.